We're very honored today to have the 25th Secretary of Defense as our special guest. Ash Carter has had a distinguished career in government service and in academic life. Very briefly, he became the Secretary of Defense, the 25th Secretary of Defense, in February of last year. Prior to that, he had served as Deputy Secretary of Defense for 2 years, and prior to that had served as Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisitions, Technology, and Logistics. In the Clinton administration, he had served for 4 years as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. For those services in the Defense Department to date, he has 5 times been awarded the Distinguished Service Medal of the Department and also been awarded the Defense Intelligence Medal. In the academic world, he's had a distinguished career as well. Graduate of Yale University, summa cum laude, majoring in theoretical physics and medieval history, an unusual combination. He won a Rhodes Scholarship, got a PhD from Oxford in theoretical physics, taught at Oxford for a while, came back and was a research fellow at MIT and at Rockefeller University, also a research associate at the Fermi Labs and the Brookhaven Labs. Ultimately, in 1986, he went to the Kennedy School, where he ultimately became the head of the Belfer Center and a chaired professor at the Kennedy School. He is the author of 11, or co-author of 11 books, and more than 100 scholarly articles on subjects like theoretical physics and management and technology and national security. So it's my pleasure to introduce the 25th Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. Appreciate you being here. It's a pleasure for me to be what I understand, David, to be the first Secretary of Defense to address the Economic Club of Washington. And one of the core tasks for me and one of my core goals in this job has been to build and to rebuild bridges between our wonderful department and the wonderful, innovative, strong American technology and industry community. So I appreciate you returning the favor by giving me the opportunity to be here as what is, of course, the largest institution with the largest budget in America. And it's that budget I'd like to discuss with you this morning. A week from now, President Obama will release his administration's budget for fiscal year 2017. About half of its discretionary portion, that is $582.7 billion to be precise, will be allocated for the Department of Defense. And today, I'd like to preview with you some of the overarching themes and some of the new investments that we'll be making. Because the fact is, this budget marks a major inflection point for the Department of Defense. In this budget, we're taking the long view. We have to, because even as we fight today's fights, we must also be prepared for the fights that might come 10, 20, or 30 years down the road. Last fall's budget deal set the size of our budget, allowing us to focus on the shape, making choices and trade-offs to adjust to a new strategic era and to seize opportunities for the future. Let me describe the strategic thinking that drove our budget decisions. First of all, it's evident that America is still today the world's foremost leader, partner, and underwriter of stability and security in every region across the globe, as we have been since the end of World War II. And as we fulfill this enduring role, it's also evident that we're entering a new strategic era. Context is important here. A few years ago, following over a decade when we were focused of necessity on large-scale counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, DoD began embarking on a major strategy shift to sustain our lead in full-spectrum warfighting. While the basic elements of our resulting defense strategy remain valid, it's also been abundantly clear to me over the last year that the world has not stood still since then. The emergence of ISIL and the resurgence of Russia being just a couple of the examples. This is reflective of a broader strategic transition underway, not unlike those we've seen in history following the end of other major wars. Today's security environment is dramatically different than the one we've been engaged in for the last 25 years, and it requires new ways of thinking and new ways of acting. I've talked with President Obama about this a great deal over the last year, and as a result, we have 5, in our minds, evolving challenges that have driven the focus of the Defense Department's planning and budgeting this year. 2 of these challenges reflect a return to great power competition. First is in Europe, where we're taking a strong and balanced approach to deter Russian aggression. And we haven't had to worry about this for 25 years. While I wish it were otherwise, now we do. Second is in the Asia Pacific, where China is rising and where we're continuing and will continue our rebalance, so-called, to maintain the stability in the region that we have underwritten for 70 years and that's allowed so many nations to rise and prosper and win. That's been our presence. Third challenge is North Korea, a hardy perennial, a threat to both us and to our allies, and that's why our forces on the Korean Peninsula remain ready every single day, today, tomorrow, to, as we call it, fight tonight. Iran is the fourth challenge, because while the nuclear deal was a good deal and doesn't limit us in the Defense Department in any way, none of its provisions affect us or limit us, we still have to counter Iran's malign influence against our friends and allies in the region, especially Israel. And challenge number 5 is our ongoing fight to defeat terrorism and especially ISIL, most immediately in its parent tumor in Iraq and Syria, and also where it is metastasizing in Afghanistan, Africa, and elsewhere. All the time all the while we're protecting our homeland and our people. While ISIL must and will be defeated now, in the longer perspective, we must also take into account in our budget that as destructive power of greater and greater magnitude falls into the hands of smaller and smaller and more aberrant groups of people, countering terrorists will likely be a continuing part of the future responsibilities of defense and national security leaders as far into the future as I can see. DoD must and will address all 5 of those challenges as part of its mission to defend our people and defend our country. Doing so requires some new thinking on our part, new posture in some regions, and also new and enhanced capabilities. For example, as we confront these 5 challenges, we'll now have to deal with them across all domains, not just the usual air, land, and sea, but also particularly in the areas of cyber, space, and electronic warfare, where our reliance on technology has given us great strengths, but also led to vulnerabilities that adversaries are eager to exploit. Key to our approach is being able to deter our most advanced competitors. We must have and be seen to have the ability to impose unacceptable costs on an advanced aggressor that will either dissuade them from taking provocative action or make them deeply regret it if they do. To be clear, the U.S. military will fight very differently in coming years than we have in Iraq and Afghanistan or in the rest of the world's recent memory. We will be prepared for a high-end enemy. That's what we call full spectrum. In our budget, our plans, our capabilities, and our actions, we must demonstrate to potential foes that if they start a war, we have the capability to win. Because a force that can deter conflict must show that it can dominate a conflict. In this context, Russia and China are our most stressing competitors. They have developed and are continuing to advance military systems that seek to threaten our advantages in specific areas And in some cases, they're developing weapons and ways of war that seek to achieve their objectives rapidly before they hope we can respond. Because of this, and because of their actions to date, from Ukraine to the South China Sea, DoD has elevated their importance in our defense planning and budgeting. While we do not desire conflict of any kind with either of these nations, and let me be clear, though they pose some similar defense challenges, they're otherwise very different nations and situations. We also cannot blind ourselves to the actions they appear to choose to pursue. Let me now highlight some new investments we're making in this budget to address both near-term challenges. I'll start with the near-term challenges and begin there with our campaign to deliver a lasting defeat to ISIL. As I said a couple of weeks ago at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and in Paris a week and a half ago, and as I'll reiterate when I meet with my coalition counterparts in Brussels next week, we must and we will defeat ISIL. Because we're accelerating the campaign, DoD is backing that up, and we need to back it up in our budget, with a total of $7.5 billion more in 2017, 50% more than in 2016. This will be critical as our updated coalition military campaign plan kicks in. For example, we've recently been hitting ISIL with so many GPS-guided smart bombs and laser-guided rockets that we're starting to run low on the ones that we use against terrorists the most. So we're investing $1.8 billion in FY17 to buy over 45,000 more of them. We're also investing to maintain more of our fourth-generation fighter and attack jets than we previously planned, including the A-10, which has been devastating to ISIL from the air. The budget defers the A-10's final retirement until 2022, replacing it with F-35 Joint Strike Fighters on a squadron-by-squadron basis, so we'll always have enough aircraft for today's conflicts. Another near-term investment in the budget is how we're reinforcing our posture in Europe to support our NATO allies in the face of Russia's aggression. In Pentagon parlance, this is called the European Reassurance Initiative, and after requesting about $800 million for last year, this year we're more than quadrupling it, for a total of $3.4 billion in 2017. That'll fund a lot of things: more rotational U.S. forces in Europe, more training and exercising with our allies, more pre-positioned warfighting gear, and infrastructure improvements to support all this. And when combined with U.S. forces already in and assigned to Europe, they're also substantial. All of this together by the end of 2017 will let us rapidly form a highly capable combined arms ground force that can respond across that theater if necessary. And as you can imagine, the budget also makes important investments in new technologies. We have to do this to stay ahead of future threats in a changing world, as other nations try to catch up with the advantages we've enjoyed for decades in areas like precision-guided munitions, stealth, cyber, and space. Some of these investments are long-term, and I'll get to them in a moment. But to help maintain our advantages now, DoD has an office that we don't often talk about, but I want to highlight today. It's called the Strategic Capabilities Office, or SCO for short. I created the SCO in 2012 when I was Deputy Secretary of Defense to help us to reimagine existing DoD and intelligence community and commercial systems by giving them new roles and game-changing capabilities to confound potential enemies. The emphasis here was on rapidity of fielding, not 10 and 15-year programs, getting stuff in the field quickly. We need to make long-term investments as well. I'll get to them in a moment, but the focus here was to keep up with the pace of the world. I picked a talented physicist, also, by the way, a Rhodes Scholar, to lead it. SCO is incredibly innovative, but it also has the rare virtue of rapid development and the even rarer virtue of keeping current capabilities viable for as long as possible. In other words, it tries to build on what we have. Smart. So it's good for the troops. It's good for the taxpayers, too. Thinking differently in this way has, as is well known in U.S. defense history, put us in space, country on the moon, computers in the pockets, information at the fingertips, all that. Taking airplanes off of the decks of ships, nuclear submarines beneath the seas, satellite networks that take pictures of the world, all those things. This kind of bold and innovative thinking can't be lost to history. It's happening now every day, not only in SCO, but in other places throughout the Department of Defense, like our dozens of laboratories and engineering centers located all over the country. As we drive this work forward, the budget grows our research and development accounts for the second year in a row, investing a total of $71.4 billion in R&D in 2017, a number that no other institution in the United States or the world comes close to. And to show the return we're getting on those investments, I'll tell you about a few projects in the SCO that it's been working on and that are funded in this budget. Some of them you may have heard of, but my guess is some of them you have not, and I know that some of them we're talking about for the very first time here. First is a project focused on advanced navigation. What the SCO's doing is taking the same kinds of micro cameras, sensors, MEMS, and so forth that are littered throughout our smartphones and everything today, and putting them on our small diameter bombs to augment the existing target capabilities on the SDB. This will eventually be a modular kit that will work with many other payloads, enabling off-network targeting through commercial components, small enough to hold in your hand like your phone and cheap enough to own like your phone. Another project uses swarming autonomous vehicles in all sorts of ways and in multiple domains. In the air, they've developed micro drones that are really fast, really resistant. They can fly through heavy winds and be kicked out the back of a fighter jet moving at Mach 0.9, like they did during an operational exercise in Alaska last year. Or they can be thrown into the air by a soldier in the middle of the Iraqi desert. And for the water, they've developed self-driving boats which can network together to do all kinds of missions, from fleet defense to close-in surveillance, without putting sailors at risk. Each one of these leverages the wider world of technology. For example, the micro drones I mentioned a moment ago use a lot of commercial components and are actually 3D printed. And the boats build on some of the same artificial intelligence algorithms that long ago and in a much more primitive form were on the Mars lander. They've also got a project on gun-based missile defense, where we're taking some of the same hypervelocity smart projectiles that we've developed for the electromagnetic gun, that's the rail gun, and using it for point defense by firing it with artillery we already have in our inventory, including the 5-inch guns on the front of every Navy destroyer, and also the hundreds of Army Paladin self-propelled howitzers. In this way, instead of spending more money on more expensive interceptors or on new platforms, we can turn past offense into future defense, defeating incoming missile raids at a much lower cost per round and thereby imposing higher costs on an attacker. In fact, we tested the first shots of the hypervelocity projectile out of a Paladin a little over a month ago. And we also found that it significantly increases the Paladin's range. And the last project I want to highlight is one that we're calling the Arsenal plane, which takes one of our oldest aircraft platforms and turns it into a flying launch pad for all sorts of different conventional payloads. In practice, the Arsenal plane will function as a very large airborne magazine, networked to 5th generation aircraft that act as forward sensor and targeting nodes, essentially combining different systems already in our inventory to create wholly new capabilities. So these are just a few examples of what the SCO has done so far, and they're working on a lot more. Now, there are many other areas where we're driving smart and essential technological innovation in the budget to stay ahead of future threats over the long term and keep our military in the decades ahead the best in the world, the first with the most, bar none. One of these is undersea capabilities, where we continue to dominate, and where the budget invests over $8.1 billion in 2017, and more than $40 billion over the next 5 years, to give us the most lethal undersea and anti-submarine force in the world. It buys more advanced payloads and munitions, like better torpedoes and unmanned undersea vehicles. It buys more advanced maritime patrol aircraft. And it not only buys 9 of our most advanced Virginia-class attack submarines over the next 5 years, it also equips more of them with a versatile Virginia payload module, which triples each submarine's platform strike capacity from 12 Tomahawk missiles to 40. Now, budgets often require trade-offs, which all of you in your own domains are very familiar with. So where trade-offs among force structure, modernization, and readiness posture needed to be made, we generally pushed to favor the latter two. This is important because our military has to have the agility and ability to win not only the wars that could happen today, but also the wars that could happen in the future. To put more money in submarines, Navy fighter jets, and a lot of other important areas, one trade-off we made was to buy only as many littoral combat ships as we really need. This is part of a broader effort in our budget to focus the Navy on having greater lethality and capability that can deter and defeat even the most high-end future threats. I'll be discussing this further tomorrow in San Diego when I visit some of our Navy's surface warfare sailors. We're also investing more in cyber, totaling nearly $7 billion in 2017 and almost $35 billion over the next 5 years. Among other things, this will help to further DoD's network defenses, which is critical, build more training ranges for our cyber warriors, and also develop cyber tools and infrastructure needed to provide offensive cyber options. I also want to mention space, because while at times in the past space was seen as a sanctuary, new and emerging threats make clear that that's not the case anymore, and we must be prepared for the possibility of a conflict that extends into space. Last year, we added over $5 billion in new investments to make us better postured for that, and in 2017, we're doing even more, enhancing our ability to identify, attribute, and negate all threatening actions in space. With so many commercial space endeavors, we want this domain to be just like the oceans and the internet, free and safe for all. There are some in this world who don't want that to happen, who see America's dominance in these and other areas and want to take that away from us in the future so that we can't operate effectively around the globe. So we're not waiting to invest until the threats are fully realized. We're investing now so we stay ahead of them. Now, of course, pioneering and dominating technological frontiers is just one way that our budget seizes opportunities for the future. We're also innovating operationally, making our contingency plans and operations more flexible and dynamic from Europe to the Asia Pacific. And we're investing to build the force of the future, as I call it. Force of the all-volunteer force of the future, because as good as our technology is, it's nothing compared to our people. Our people are the reason we have the finest fighting force the world has ever known. And we have to ensure that the talent we recruit and retain generations from now is just as good as the excellent people we have today. I've made several announcements over the last few months to help to do that. We're opening all remaining combat positions to women, very simply so that we have access to 50% of our population for the all-volunteer force. And every American who can meet our exacting standards, and that's important, will have the equal opportunity to contribute to our mission. We're also implementing several new initiatives to improve and modernize our personnel management systems, to create what I call on-ramps and off-ramps that allow more people inside and outside DoD to engage with and contribute to our mission people outside defense to come in for a while, maybe not for a career, but for a few years, and contribute to the most consequential mission that a human being can contribute to. And our own people to get out and learn about how the rest of the world works and make sure that they're up to date and up to speed. I've emphasized this both in Silicon Valley and in our Boston technology hub. And we're strengthening the support we provide to our military families to improve their quality of life. The emphasis here being on retention of excellent people, and where we can, making it possible for them to reconcile the needs of having a family with our needs of military service. Not always possible to reconcile, but we're making an effort where we can, consistent with the profession of arms and our needs. There'll be more to come along this line. Now, having told you about the budget, and particularly talking to an audience like this, I need to say something also about how we're reforming the DoD enterprise to make us more efficient. I can't come before a group like this and ask for the amount of money that I believe we need for our defense unless I can also satisfy you that we're spending it in the best possible way. Just like you have your shareholders, we have our taxpayers, and we owe it to them to ensure that we're doing everything we can to spend our defense dollars as wisely and responsibly as possible. That's why, along with our budget, we're keeping up our focus on, for example, acquisition reform, where we're already starting to see results from our better buying power initiatives and where we're looking to do more and get better. We're also doing more to reduce overhead, which we expect to help provide us more than $8 billion over the next 5 years, $8 billion that we can use elsewhere for real capability and not overhead. And we're looking at reforms to the Goldwater-Nichols Act, the famous act of the 1980s, that defines much of DoD's institutional organization. On this last point, we've been doing a thorough review for the last several months, and I expect to begin receiving recommendations on that in coming weeks and making decisions. Let me close by touching on the broader shift that is reflected in this budget. For a long time, DoD tended to focus and plan and prepare for whatever big war people thought was coming over the horizon. At one point becoming so bad that after a while it started to come at the expense of current conflicts, long term at the expense of the here and now. Thankfully, we were able to realize that over the last decade, correct it, and turn our attention to the fights we were in. We had to do that. The difference is, while that kind of singular focus may have made sense when we were facing off against the Soviets or sending hundreds of thousands of troops to Iraq and Afghanistan, it won't work for the world we live in today. Now we have to think and do a lot of different things about a lot of challenges at the same time. Sad to say, but true. Not just ISIL and other terrorist groups, but also competitors like Russia and China, and threats like North Korea and Iran. We don't have the luxury of just one opponent, or the choice between current fights and future fights. We have to do both, and that's what this budget is designed to do. When this forum we're in now was founded 30 years ago, its inaugural speaker declared that America's best days should still lie ahead. With this budget and with our magnificent men and women of the Department of Defense, our best years will lie ahead, as those men and women of the Department of Defense continue to defend our country, help make a better world for our children. Thank you. Very well, may I hear?
In introducing you, I neglected to say that when you were in high school, you were a lacrosse player, a cross-country runner, a football player, and also basketball. How did you manage to do all those sports?
I always did a sport in each of the 3 seasons, and I did swimming and diving in the summer. Plus, I always had a job at night. I always worked at night, and we had fishing boat, gas station, hospital orderly. I was busy guy, but I couldn't do all the sports you named at the same time. So when people got a lot bigger, taller than I did, I gave up basketball, started wrestling. When they got beefier than I did, I gave up football and started to run cross country. And lacrosse is one of those things that if you're pretty good at everything, you can be really good at lacrosse. If you're pretty dexterous and you're pretty fast and you have pretty good endurance and you're pretty tough, but you're not a big football player or a tall basketball player or something, you can do good.
So when you're the Secretary of Defense, you have all the military under you. They're in pretty good shape. You have to stay in shape. What do you do to stay in shape? You look like you're in pretty good shape.
I try to work out whenever I can, really every day. If I can, I drive everybody crazy, although I think people really like it. I walk a lot in the hall. One of the nice things about working in the Pentagon is it's got these great big hallways, and I go out and I walk around and I talk to people, and you kind of do a little bit of management by walking around.
You just walk into somebody's office and surprise them?
See, when you get to the top, everybody comes to you. So you could sit there all day and not move. And if I worked in a smaller office building, I don't know, nobody has a building as big as the Pentagon. I think I'd go nuts because I really like to get out and move around.
Okay. So let's talk about the budget for a moment. Is it harder to negotiate the budget with your service chiefs or with OMB? What's harder?
I got to say, OMB by tradition is not totally, but quite deferential to professional military and DoD advice. So we get a lot of latitude, I would say, compared to the civil agencies. Within the department, we have a process that's gone back for a long time, but it really makes the best use of the uniformed and civilian leadership. I was Undersecretary, as you mentioned, for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, and whenever a decision was made above me, I always said, geez, I wish somebody'd ask the person who has to carry that out. So I believe in involving the people who have to carry out these decisions and execute these budgets in the decision making. So I'm very inclusive in that regard. I think we have excellent professional military judgment in all of our services, and that's all reflected in this budget. This is what these people who do this for a living and have for many decades think is the best way to spend this money. I have a lot of respect for their judgment.
Right, suppose your budget, the defense budget the president's going to propose is $582 billion, more or less. So suppose Congress says, we really think you need more. What would you do? You resist that? You won't take that money?
Well, they didn't, no. Let me say that. I mean, look, the budget that we have reflects the bipartisan budget deal of this year, for which I am grateful, and I'll tell you why. We have started every fiscal year for 6 years, David, with a continuing resolution. I won't go through, most people in this room know how debilitating that is, how inefficient it is. It's dispiriting to our troops. They say, hey, what the hell's going on here? Foreigners, other countries look and say, hey, what's going on with you guys? Can't you get your act together? So it's very important that we not be herky-jerky proceeding. And it was only 2 years, only a 2-year budget deal. I would have liked something longer than that. But it was what I have hoped for and was speaking about since I became Secretary of Defense, which was a coming together in Washington.
Okay.
End of gridlock. And now, what that means, to get your question, is did I get everything I want? No. But I think that's the definition of people coming together and compromising, is everybody walked away without having everything they wanted. That said, with the money we have, the shape is what matters, and we've been working on the shape within the size that the bipartisan deal gave us.
For many years, we've had a dual budget for defense. We've had the regular budget, and then we had a so-called OCO account where it was for the war. And is the new budget agreement such that you can't get more money for OCO, and the 582 is including of that?
It is. 582 does include OCO, and the budget deal did take account of both. Let me tell you why the theory of OCO is a good one. The theory of OCO is Overseas Contingency Operations funding, so-called wartime funding, but it is funding that is intended to cover the variable costs of operations that go up and down in the course of a year. The base budget funds the enduring military that'll be here 10 years, 20 years down the road. And if you think about it, David, think about hurricanes, for example, just a prosaic example, but a major hurricane occurs about every 3 years, and we're asked to respond. So you can have us do that in two ways. You can give us the money every year, and we'll spend it. Or you can give us the money when the hurricane occurs, and we'll spend it then. That's obviously more efficient. So it makes sense to have variable costs in the budget.
Yeah,
and that's what OCO does.
It's been leaked, and sometimes there are leaks from the Pentagon. You probably are familiar with that. It's been leaked that the Navy would like to have a few more ships, and I think you cut the number down to about 40 littoral ships, and they wanted maybe more. So suppose they go to Capitol Hill and try to get more. Will you resist those, or?
Yeah, well, I'm going to argue for what we, including in the Navy, think is the best balance. And by the way, the size of the Navy is increasing. We're going to go up to 308 ships. So
what do we have now? 280 or so?
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly right. So 78 actually. We are increasing the size of the Navy, but what's really important in this era is to increase the lethality of each ship. Okay. And so we're emphasizing that, and we're also emphasizing undersea. So yes, we had to make trade-offs. In each of the services, you make trade-offs, as I said, amongst force structure, capability, investment, and readiness. All three of those are important, and you just have to, we only have so many dollars we have to balance.
There's one ship that you're building. It's a new Gerald Ford class aircraft carrier that supposedly will cost as much as $15 billion for one ship. Yeah. How did one ship get to be so expensive, and are you going to build more of those?
Well, we are. I'm sure we'll build more aircraft carriers in the future. We're not going to build them in the way that was built. That's an example. I talked about the need for discipline. That is a program that was undisciplined. We're trying to wrestle that one into shape, but I'm not going to try to justify the history of the Ford class carrier over the last 15 years or so. We have been trying. I started when I was 18L to get that program under control. By the way, a lot of our programs, we are getting under control now, and the figures reflect that. But we've got to do more. It's important because not only for efficiency's sake, but for the confidence of our business community and our political leaders and our people. They say, hey, look, we're giving you, all this much money for defense. We need to see that you're using it well. And when we have an example of that, where there's a cost overrun of that magnitude, it casts into doubt the whole enterprise. That's not okay. But to answer your question, I think, of course, we'll buy more aircraft carriers in the future. I'm supposing we will, but not that way.
Okay, so on ISIL, do you expect it's likely, or any possible way that you can see the U.S. government during the Obama administration sending ground troops into the Syria-Iraq area to combat ISIL?
Well, we are.
Well, so significant ground troops.
See that.
50,000, 100,000, anything significant.
We're looking for a couple of things about that. Just to remind everybody, we have 3,700 boots on the ground in Iraq today, and we're looking to do more. We're looking for opportunities to do more. To get to your question, we're not looking to substitute for local forces. We're looking to enable local forces. Why is that? It's because we not only have to beat ISIL, we have to keep them beaten. That is, there has to be somebody who sustains the defeat afterwards. We know what it's like when you don't have that force to sustain the defeat. And so our strategic approach is to enable capable, motivated local forces. They're hard to find in that part of the world, but they do exist. But do we have troops that are helping them? Yes. We're actually looking for opportunities to do more. So as we go north to Mosul from Ramadi, Heat, Mosul, we have to take Mosul, we have to take Raqqa. That'll prove that there is no such thing as an Islamic State based on this ideology. We need to take those two cities. You'll see us doing more. We've asked for more, and
more
every time the chairman
troops?
and I have asked the president for more capability, to do that. He said yes, and I expect that'll continue. Oh, one other thing, David, which is it won't just be Americans. This is crucial. It's got to be the other members of our so-called coalition. A lot of them are making considerable contributions to this, but some of them are not. And you really have to look at this. This is a fight of civilization, again, for its own survival. And we need everybody, and that's all the Europeans, the Gulf states, which aren't doing enough, Turkey, which is right there on the border. So there are a lot that need to make more contributions. But are we going to do more? Yes, we're going to do more, because we've got to win.
In your coalition, you have about 65 countries, but I think in Davos and other places, you've said that the other members of the coalition aren't doing very much. And what are you doing to encourage them to do more?
Well, not all of them are in that category, but many of them are. And so what am I doing to encourage that? Next week, I will be, for much of the week, in Europe, and I've asked the defense ministers, the first time ever, interestingly, since the campaign against ISIL began, that the defense ministers, not the foreign ministers, they've met before, but the defense ministers getting together, and what I'm going to do is sit down and say, here is the campaign plan for, if you think in World War II newsreel picture terms, you think of an arrow going north to take Mosul and another arrow coming south to take Raqqa. That's kind of a good mental picture of taking care of ISIL in Syria and Iraq. Of course, then we have other places in the world, but it's necessary, not sufficient, but it's necessary to destroy ISIL in Iraq and Syria. And what I'm going to do with them is say, all right, here are all the capabilities that are needed. Boots on the ground, airplanes in the air, more prosaic things, logistics, bridging, training for those police that are going to patrol cities like they're patrolling Ramadi now once the cities are retaken. And I'm going to say, okay, guys, let's match up what is needed to win with what you have, and kind of give everybody the opportunity to make an assignment for themselves. This is important. The United States will lead this, and we're determined, but other people have to do their part, because this really is, civilization has to fight for itself.
Well, we've flown about 10,000 sorties over Iraq and Syria in this effort, but most of them have been from the United States. Or is anybody else actually flying and dropping bombs?
Yeah, others are flying and dropping bombs, and we're grateful for that. But there are other ones that are flying transport aircraft, that are flying tankers, that are flying AWACS aircraft, that are flying ISR, reconnaissance planes. There are people doing training. The Brits, the Australians, a number of people besides us are doing training in Iraq and taking action in Syria. So I don't want to suggest that we're doing it all by ourselves now. There are some folks that are really doing amazing, courageous, creative, heroic work. But the reality is that we've got a coalition that is committed at the political level to defeat ISIL, and that needs to be translated into the operational military contributions they're making. That's what I'll be doing next week in Europe.
The Russians say they want to defeat ISIL, but their guided missiles don't seem to be going to the right places. Is that because their technology is not as good as ours?
Yeah, no, that's so true. And they did. They said they were going to go in and fight ISIL, and that's not what they did. That would be welcome if they did it, but it's not what they're doing. In the main, what they're doing is propping up Assad. And so this is wrong-headed in two ways. It's wrong-headed in the sense that it's not doing what needs to be done. Remember, they have a threat from ISIL too, in the Caucasus and so forth. I mean, you've seen that ISIL is going after the Russians too, so serious business for them as it is for us and the rest of the civilized world.
So when they're flying around and we're flying around, how do you coordinate? Because we know what they're doing.
We've worked that out. We have a memorandum of understanding. We talk at the working level and make sure that we have safety of flight. And they're behaving very professionally in that regard. But what they need to do, and I don't know whether they'll do that, is get on a different strategic track. And that would be one where
They help us to make the transition in Syria that has to occur to end the civil war there and get a decent life for people there again. And that means without having the whole state of Syria collapse and all the state structures go away, without the person of Bashar Assad, who is a lightning rod for the civil war, but a transition where the state structures, as the Russians say, survive, and the moderate opposition and those state structures combine to make a government of Syria that can run the place on some decent principles, and then help us turn against ISIL. That's what they should be doing, but they got off on the wrong foot. I think they have a self-defeating strategy. I don't know how long it'll take them to realize that.
Speaking of the Russians, on Ukraine, it's been reported that we're training in the United States Ukrainian soldiers and sending them back now, and do you expect to have more conflict there?
We actually train them in Ukraine, mostly, and we send equipment and so forth, and it's hard to say. Obviously, while we're watching the Russians' activities in the Middle East, we're not taking our eye off of Ukraine. And I mentioned that we're making investments in Europe, supporting our NATO structure in Europe, and also supporting the Ukrainians militarily and in other ways.
You expect much more conflict in the near future?
As well. It's hard to say whether the Minsk Accords are not being implemented to the letter. At the same time, the level of violence is lower than it has been. I certainly hope it stays that way. And the Minsk Accords is the right way to go to kind of settle things down there. But don't forget, David, even if things settle down and Minsk is implemented, Crimea was still annexed.
I know.
And so you've got to look at this conduct by Russia, and the rest of the Europeans do as well, and say this is an unwelcome development in European history. As I said in the speech, it's been a quarter century since we've had to be preoccupied with that. But unfortunately, it looks like now we do. I wish it were otherwise, but both Ukraine and in NATO, we're going to have to help countries to harden themselves against Russian influence, including the little green men phenomenon, and also mount, as we did in decades past, staunch defense of our NATO allies.
So in Afghanistan, before you leave office, the Obama administration is over, would you expect that we'll still have 8,000 to 10,000 soldiers there?
Well, the plan is to have the 9,800 through the end of the year. That's our current plan. Obviously, we adjust plans. The president adjusted his plans in October. The thing to look for in this coming up season is the growing capability of the Afghan security force. Remember, the whole deal here is over a period of time, it's not going to end by the end of this year. But we have a plan to stay with it. The budget I described, I should have said this, in the budget contains full funding for the Afghan security forces. Remember, that's the key. They're supposed to be increasingly able to take over their own security. So in this season coming up, you watch whether they are using operational mobility more than they did in this last fighting season, whether they'll have now fixed-wing aircraft. We just delivered A-29s to them, rotary wing aircraft, all these capabilities that they didn't have last season, they'll have this season. And you hope that will, and not hope, but that's the plan, is to have that strength in their hand against the Taliban. But full self-sufficiency is years away, and everybody knows that.
So you mentioned North Korea as one of your favorite subjects in your speech. Did the North Koreans explode a hydrogen bomb recently?
I don't think that they were as successful as they may have claimed. We don't know that fully, and I don't want to go any further than that. But so that's the story. But don't forget, I don't want you to take any consolation from that, because nuclear weapons in the hands of North Korea, particularly coupled with ballistic missiles, coupled with their, how to say this, odd demeanor, and position right there on the DMZ, that's a really serious combination. They're not in the headlines a lot, But we, as I said, never take our eye off that. Every single day we're watching that DMZ.
You famously wrote an article with Bill Perry when you were not in government saying that maybe a preemptive strike against an ICBM or other missile capabilities of the North Koreans would be something the U.S. should consider. Do you still have that view?
Well, that was a different circumstance then. It was a test launch missile, and our policy was that we were not to tolerate it, and we were trying to figure out how to not tolerate it. So that was then, and now is now. But for now, the nuclear program of North Korea is a serious concern. Their ballistic missiles are a serious concern. The size of their force positioned right there on the DMZ, the size of their special forces, which they work on quite hard. In every way, they're a serious business. And I just got to remind you, war on the Korean Peninsula, we will win, no question about it. But it is a very, very savage and intense war, and so it's not something that it's not an area where you want deterrence to fail. But deterrence has to be incredibly strong there, and every day we need to do it.
Now the Chinese seem to be building islands in the South China Sea. Are we going to just let them do that? Or are we going to? Do you think they're going to use it for military purposes? Are we going to send our ships nearby?
They are, and we're reacting. We have to react. By the way, it's true that they're not the only ones that are doing this. And therefore, our formal position, as a matter of what about these claims in the South China Sea, is that we, the United States, don't adjudicate those claims. What we do want is everybody to stop land reclamation and stop militarization. What the effect, our reaction is, first of all, the one you just described, namely, we're going to keep doing what we've always done, what we've done for 70 years. We're going to fly and sail and operate where international law permits, period. And we demonstrate that, and that won't stop. But second, we're making all these investments that you see in our defense budget that are specifically oriented towards the checking, the development of the Chinese military. Third, they're having the effect, and I don't know when this will dawn on them, of causing widespread concern in the region, which makes others react, including others react by joining up with us. So let me give you a few examples. Vietnam, for example. I was in Vietnam a few months ago, very eager to work with us on maritime security. Vietnam. And then good old friends that you're very familiar with, Australia, the Philippines. You've probably noticed that Japan is a rising military power in the Pacific and close, longtime friend of the United States. So all around the region, people are reacting. The Chinese are, with this kind of stuff, going to get people to react and compensate, but more importantly, it's self-isolating behavior. I don't know when they'll realize that, whether they will realize that, but you know, it's not the American approach to have a Cold War there, to carve up the region, to divide. We're not trying to stop the Chinese from doing what they're doing. And look at what the United States has brought to the Asia-Pacific region over the last 70 years, the most rapidly growing region economically in the world. It's been the peace and stability there that we underwrote that's allowed first Japan to rise, then South Korea, then Taiwan, then Southeast Asia, and now China and India. That's what we've stood for, and they've benefited from that. So to disrupt the security environment where half of humanity lives and half of humanity's economic behavior is not a good idea on their part, but certainly for our part, we intend to continue our strong role there.
Before you leave office, do you think Guantanamo will be closed?
Don't know. I've been completely unabashed about this. I would like to see Guantanamo closed. I think on balance it would be good for us. But here, David, is the issue. There are people in that detention facility that, there's no other way to say this, have to be detained. There's no way that I can safely have them transferred somewhere else. And so the answer to your question is, can it be closed safely? For us to do that, we have to find another place to detain the people who must be detained. Now, at the moment, it's against the law to establish another detention facility. Some in Congress have indicated a willingness to consider a proposal to build an alternative facility. We have such a proposal, and we'll see whether we get the support for it. This is something that I just would rather not leave to my successor, the job of this detention business, and to the next president. But I don't know whether we'll get it done this year, but it's not something that to do it this way I've described. We need the help and support of Congress. I hope we're getting it. I'm working on it. I think it would be a good thing for the country on balance.
How damaging were the Snowden revelations, and has it made it difficult for you to work with Silicon Valley firms?
Well, yeah, it was no question. It was damaging first to our security and compromising important secrets, to our foreign policy and relations around the world, but critically to our industry. Yes, it created some distrust, which I'm working very hard to try to overcome. Not by preaching to people and not by, but trying to work through issues. But also, for our companies, it has been used as essentially a guise for protectionism by some competitors to American companies. No question about it. And so that it has put, and Edward Snowden's actions, put our companies at a disadvantage to the point where some countries that from whom it is wild to hear such a claim are saying, oh, store your data in our country, it'll be safer there. And you go, oh, really? Safer than here? But I'm intent upon building bridges for all kinds of bridges of trust. When I started out in this business and was a physicist, everybody, David, in the generation older than me, that brought me up, so to speak, they were all like Manhattan Project people and so forth. They had a reflex that it was an important duty to use your knowledge for good and in service of the public good. Now, I can't expect that for everybody today. Not as big a fraction of our young people have the experience of closeness to the government or the military enterprise. That's why I'm trying to reach out to people and make them familiar with what we're doing, give them a user-friendly way to make a contribution. I do find that people out in Silicon Valley and all in our innovative community, David, and I really need to say this, these are people who are where they are because they like to do things of consequence. They see that defending our country and defending our world is something of consequence. And so the mission does grab them. They get it. I mean, they look at ISIL and they look at these problems I've talked about, Russia and China and so on, and they all understand this is a serious matter. We have to defend ourselves. But I need to meet them halfway, listen to them, and find a way in this very different age from when I started, where a young person can see their way to contributing to the greater, what's better than waking up in the morning and being part of something bigger than yourself? That's what they get.
So you've, in effect, now said that women can be in all combat parts of our military force. The Marines were not thrilled with that, I think. You just overruled them, or how did that work?
Well, now, the Marines raised some issues which we have to address, and we are addressing in implementation. That didn't make me say we're not going to do it, but it made me say, and if you read my statement, I'm working right now on the implementation. This is serious. Simply declaring things open is not effective implementation. There are real issues here. And we're working through those issues. And so it was important to them, for example, that I say, and I did, that the way we implemented this was going to be important, that standards were not going to be relaxed, that there would be no quotas. This was about creating the opportunity, but I couldn't make it so that women would be able to satisfy those standards in the numbers that meant, so there's a lot that still needs to be done here. So I thought they raised some very important considerations, and we're addressing those in implementation. But for the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and our Special Operations Commander, they all recommended no additional restrictions. They also gave me their reasoning, and I took all this reasoning together, put it together, and said what I said, which is this is the right decision, but we have to implement it carefully. Standards are important. Don't expect quotas. So we're going to do it in a serious, professional way. Like, by the way, and I'm not saying this about me, or I'm saying about the Department of Defense, I'm so proud of a place like that is a learning, adapting organization. I mean, they take on things. We took on counterinsurgency, for example. This was before my time, right? Brand new form of warfare, and mastered it. You may not have liked the circumstances. I'm not trying to say that, but we got really good at it. So this is a place that takes on a mission, and then very carefully, very deliberately, very professionally works it through. And we'll do that. We'll do that for this. I'm completely confident.
So you have a PhD in theoretical physics, and you're summa cum laude graduate in physics and medieval history from Yale. When you deal with members of Congress, are they often on the same intellectual plane that you are? And is that hard for you to...
Yeah, sure.
How do you deal with that?
Well, the joke that everybody tells me, not with Congress specifically in mind, is that I have finally, they were two completely separate majors. They were kind of a right brain, left brain kind of thing. I liked them both. But people now say I now work in a field that is the perfect union of medieval history and physics. But for Congress, I'm going to say something that may surprise you. I find that the great majority of members of Congress that I interact with are really serious, thoughtful, want to do the right thing. They sometimes find themselves in a situation where they can't find a way to do the right thing, and I think that's frustrating for a lot of them. That's why when we do come together behind this budget deal and so forth, I think it's a huge triumph. And the folks who did that, who despite all odds sat down, worked it out the old-fashioned way in Congress, I really think deserve a lot of credit for it. Wasn't everything everybody wanted, wasn't everything I wanted, wasn't forever, it's only for 2 years. But that's the way things ought to be done. You can't just pound your spoon on your high chair in this country and get what you want. I can't do that as Secretary of Defense. I got to work with other people.
So a final question. What's the best part about being Secretary of Defense?
The troops. Absolutely, it's being among the people. That's what lifts you up every time, and you look at them, you say, and it's incredible. My wife works, so she can't spend a lot of time doing things, but when she does, she loves the troops, and their families. And these are fantastic people. That's by far and away the best part.
And the worst part, I should say, is having to write the letters to families?
Yeah, no, you never get used to the loss. And geez, I've been at this now 7 years, and fortunately the numbers are less than they were when I came in, but that never stops being hard.
Thank you very much for your service to our country.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.